Hello, in this video I want to have a look at once more the Hermetic Code and how it applies in the USA, and we're going to feature the Missouri State Capitol building in Jefferson City. And previous series was on Winnipeg in Canada. Our previous series to that was on New York, and you'll find that the same patterns are happening over and over again. Different cities, different essentially it's the same time around that same period, but you'll find that both in symbolism and in more importantly in weights and measures, that the same methodology will appear over and over again consistently, just to reinforce the fact that this is or at the very least was quite a let's say widespread type of architecture, still being practiced today, but now it's more secretive, especially at the time. Even like sort of around about this period, we had the City Beautiful movement of architecture, and it was a wonderful time, I suppose you'd say, in many ways, because basically the Hermetic Code was becoming publicized, it was becoming more open. It was a very different time, and then we had World War II and basically the birth of corporatism, the end of the lodge system, and really some big steps backwards in terms of society. But Missouri Capitol building, this is the southern portico. It's sort of more towards the southeast, but this is the southern side. A couple of sculpture groups there on either side of the steps. Most importantly, on the right hand side, we see clearly Hermes, Mercury. He's got the anchor and the cornucopia as well. While on the top, the Ceres, the Roman goddess of architecture, Demeter in the Greek tradition, but female goddess, agricultural cycles being the main part. But the building itself, as within all of these, it's loaded with symbolic elements which might be overlooked, but the weights and the measures are the ones that really count. And so the columns on the southern side are 48 feet high. Now there are 8 of them, and so what you find is it's not just the one column if you add them all up together, but I'm just going to do one single column height. So 48 feet on the southern side, or the main entrance. Now as we move around to the rear of the building, we come to the southern side. We'll have coming up any moment now. But yeah, so not just the town plans, not just the individual building plans. I might remind you, this is a major the major public building in the centre of town, not just some random building. And that's the key point with this. These were built to design, not to off-the-shelf specifications. They were engineered. They were pure architecture in these buildings. It's not just some copy-paste, some random building. A lot of money, a lot of effort went into constructing them. They basically form the center point of the town. But okay, so on the southern side we have 6 columns. So you see a curved portico here, and they are 6 columns of 30 feet high on each ones. Now also on this side, so you have the river just behind us, but we also have this fountain sculpture group, the Fountain of the Centaurs, half man, half horse. You also find the similar traditions in, for instance, in India, but a few legends regarding the centaur. But basically, it's half beast, half man, and often said to represent the horsemen. For instance, what we think of them as Mongols, but earlier which were basically a represent to the Greeks and the Romans. The horsemen of the steppe were pretty much the barbarians, or the bestial nature of man, and even as some myths still carry on. Even up until the Mongol period and the Huns, that these guys basically lived on their horses, and that's sort of partially true. You can, anyway, at least you get an understanding of where the mythology arose from. And barbarians, for instance, translates to one who does not speak Greek, and so anyway, that's another thing. But the Capitol building itself, so it's in this revivalist style, basically built, designed around now St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Might be a immediate reference, but it goes back to Renaissance architecture, which in itself was a revival of the classical, like the Greco-Roman period of architecture. For instance, the gods and goddesses in the statuary, the types of columns, the pediment, that triangular. This is the pediment here, and and you'll see this is a standard: horses and cows on one side. The bull represents Zeus. The central figure is Athena. They're stylized according to each location, but if you compare them, you'll find it's the same thing. Athena is basically in the center, and those are canvas leaf designs. Now the columns, as we see here, are of the Corinthian order, but they've been modified to have local vegetation in there. Typically, it should be a canvas, but these are a slight variation on it. We also have, on the main steps there, we have a statue of Jefferson, 13 feet high, no less. But so this school of architecture was also a school of philosophy. So it wasn't just about the style of architecture, it's also connected with the more classical types of philosophy, especially empiricism and rationalism, and this concept that as opposed to postmodernist philosophy, that these schools believe firstly that there is such a thing as truth, and that truth could be either through theory or through measurement and study of nature, that this truth could be understood and could be achieved. Again, so yeah, it's not just a style of art. Just as postmodernism is an architectural and art style, so were these, for instance, the revivalist classical type of theories. But so the building itself. Now, the Cornerstone Ceremony of buildings, for instance, I couldn't find, these are some of the pictures I could find. We had the Moose Lodge in attendance, so the parade for the Cornerstone. Pardon for the interruption. So the Missouri State Capitol, the Cornerstone Ceremony. Cornerstone ceremonies are very important, especially connected with Masonic traditions. Now, the ceremonies in regard, especially in Europe, sort of faded off, but it was, especially with the Masons in America, Canada, Australia, the ceremonial aspect of laying the cornerstone and the rituals involved with that really become more elaborate, more of a public spectacle once again. For instance, Capitol building, Cleopatra's Needle in New York, or the Statue of Liberty in New York, and that the tools used also be, still now, even like when you break groundbreaking ceremonies, you'll use a silver spade, like a ceremonial spade. But that's groundbreaking. You have the Cornerstone Ceremony, and then you have the topping off ceremony. So there's basically a life cycle to buildings. Now, for instance, Missouri State Capitol building, the cornerstone laid on 1915. There was a time capsule included in that. Now, that time capsule was removed and replaced in 2015. But as an example of rituals regarding the cornerstone being on the level and being on the square. So, for instance, here we see the first stone for Baltimore, Ohio railway, I believe, and using the square to check the stone. Now, that's not just practical, it's a ceremonial aspect. So, for instance, the Missouri State Capitol, when they removed and then replaced the time capsule, we see this Masonic ceremony. And firstly, they're squaring the stone, so by the square. Now, even still in our vernacular, this is a square house, for instance, or it's a square deal. The concept of square being like an honest person or an honest dealing comes from this older vocabulary based on having a square stone. And even amongst code words, so we meet on the level and we part on the square. So again, in these, I'm focusing on Freemasons because they're the most well known. But so firstly, we're squaring the stone, but also in the ritual in regards to cornerstones and these important rites of passage in the life of a building includes the level. So they squared the stone, but they're also leveling the stone. Now this, of course, would have been done with other equipment, more modern equipment. This is purely ritualistic. This is part of the ritual in the again, the life cycles of a building. There's quite an interesting philosophy in regards to that, how a building it goes through stages. But anyway, earlier picture I showed. So in the background, we're squaring the stone, but in the background we have the rod with the square and compass and the G in there. And again, back to the Missouri Capitol building and the rededication of the Cornerstone and the time capsule, we see that same rod. So this is a quite old ritual. Now, for instance, we can also, this is Paraguay and the international airport there. And well, this is another example, like a much greater, larger example of it. And but for instance, St. Mary's Catholic Cathedral here in Sydney, amongst the museum items, we have a ceremonial trowel, a ceremonial square, and the ceremonial mallet. Now, these, of course, are standard symbols within, well, for instance, because Masons emerged from strict Masons, like it's in stone masons, tilers, brick masons, these types of trades. And while we're in Joplin, Missouri, we have the Scottish Rite Cathedral, and well, 33 levels on the Scottish Rite, 32 open, 33 by invitation. So the number 33, the double-headed eagle, very Scottish Rite, Freemasonic. So the building itself, like so many other buildings, major public buildings, have these rituals in there, and Masons will be involved, even if they're not directly involved, if you want to say, in the planning and funding. It's become a tradition to have these rituals throughout these buildings. Now, again, just as a so the Missouri State Capitol, we have Ceres or Demeter, Greek goddess of agriculture, but on each side of the main stairs we have two sculpture groups, one with Hermes. The picture you don't see it too clearly, but he has an anchor, and there's also the cornucopia, or the horn of plenty. Now, there's also a female statue that's not labelled, so you could give her a couple of names without. But for instance, that's a coin, ancient coin of the cornucopia and Ceres as well. So, who exactly that female figure is, I probably should have checked it out a little bit more, at least officially. But very often, anyway, you find very often that these are. Even the official description doesn't quite match the more accurate description of them anyway. But here is a Oddfellows tracing board. So Oddfellows, Masons, Druids, Buffaloes, and the Elks, these type of groups, have very similar symbols, and for instance the cornucopia, because both the female and the male or Hermes group sculptures have this cornucopia underneath them. But on the northern side, we also have a fountain, the fountain of the centaurs, and I touched on that earlier, but again, it's gods and goddesses, astronomical connections as well. And the fountain of the centaurs now, there are a few different levels and ways to think about these, but you know, as a group, once more, you see this Greco-Roman god pattern, but also if you look a little bit further, the symbols and emblems within them are very astronomical connections to the constellations and so forth. But inside the building itself, we see the rotunda, and as with all these buildings, they're bloody beautiful, you know, and the craftsmanship and the detail that goes into them is pretty amazing. Yeah, as opposed to what passes for, you know, architecture these days. Compare it to then, and well, at least in my mind, you know, tastes vary, but there is no comparison. But in regards to, again, the tracing boards, we see the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns. Now, in the rotunda, we see, for instance, on the lower floor, the Doric columns, a very simple, like basically straight up and down column. Now, through the hole there in the oculus, we can see the Ionic columns there, so the straight columns with the swirls on the end there. But also in the chambers and a few other places around there, you also see Ionic columns there on the inside. Now, Ionic represents the female, the mature female as opposed to the youthful maiden or the virgin. So we have the Doric and the Ionic, and we have Corinthian columns on the outside. The columns are slightly unusual that they're not strict acanthus. They've varied them a little bit, but in the pediment and elsewhere throughout the building we still see traditional acanthus, and that's very much connected to the column of beauty, or the Corinthian column, the more elaborate of the three, and that's acanthus leaves in there. But we have three types of the Greco-Roman column: the Doric, which represents the male, or it's also called the column of strength, and it's also connected with sight. And we have the Ionic column, the second of the three to emerge from the Greek orders, the column of wisdom connected to feeling, the female, and we also have the maiden or the virgin, which is the column of beauty and connected to the sense of smell. Now, this is some pictures from Ninth Heretic sent me from Ghent in Belgium. Now we have these sculpture group. Now, immediately they might not ring a bell, but it's written in French, but we have beauty, strength and wisdom there. So we have the virgin, the maiden, we have the male, and then we have the adult female, or the column of wisdom, male being strength in the middle, and beauty. Now it's just shifted order, but the same thing. Again, that statue, you might look past it without the eye. But what we see here again is essentially it's a Masonic reference: the male, the female, and the virgin. Strength, wisdom, and beauty. The sculpture there in Ghent was beauty, strength, and wisdom. Same thing, just a little bit, a slight variation on it. Now, the Missouri State Capitol and how that will connect to the part. So this system, these symbols are ancient. Now, you can easily unbroken trace them back to the Greco-Roman period, but they actually emerged earlier than that. But at least in the available records, it's clearly in here now. Mark Wilson Jones and the Salamis stone showed how it's a conversion tool, which not only has a Doric and the Ionic, but also has our modern foot going back 1,500 years before, even older than what it would be officially recognised. So the foot that we use now is an ancient system. This whole history of it being, it's silly, it shouldn't be sold. But Doric, Ionic and Corinthian, so 48 feet, this is the 48 feet high columns on the Missouri State Capitol are exactly the same height as the 48 feet columns on the Parthenon, which is a lovely conversion point between Doric and Ionic and the allegedly modern English foot, which is anything but English and anything but modern. So again, weights and measures, and just the standard information in regards to the history of weights and measures is deplorably, horribly bad, horribly, like, not, it's not a matter of opinion in regards to whether its accuracy. Now, the details of exactly when might be argued, but the accuracy of the official mythology in regards to weights and measures is just a joke. But anyway, the Missouri State Capitol, there's a whispering gallery in the dome. So if you're up in the dome, you can whisper, and it will travel around the dome. It can be heard on the other side. So with just a whisper, you can be heard better than what you would be shouting across. Now, this is a standard feature. So, for instance, recent series I did on New York, I'm not sure if I meant, but Grand Central Terminal, there's a whispering gallery underneath. Hermes statue on the top, whispering gallery beneath it. Now, as above, so below, keep that in mind. So, but the Manitoba Legislative Building in Winnipeg, just a recent series on Winnipeg, there's the Pool of a Black Star is essentially, it's a whispering gallery, so it's tuned to the rest of the building. You can speak soft in there and be heard throughout quite a bit of the building. And there's a Hermes above it. However, the whispering gallery in Missouri, the whispering gallery is above and the Hermes is below, but we still have this. I think it's an interesting connection. I wouldn't bet on it, but that we have the Mercury statue or Hermes statue is low in regards to the building, and the whispering gallery is high, as where Manitoba, Winnipeg, and Grand Central Terminal, we have a low whispering gallery with a high with a Mercury, Hermes or Mercury above it. Might be a thing, I just think, because again, when you see these things, it's really worth encountering. I mean, not dismiss. If you dismiss something as I've learned the lessons the hard way, you dismiss it as coincidence. You're really missing something. If you think it's a coincidence, it's really worth following through. While we're here, okay, on the north side, the 6 columns are 30 feet high in Independence we have quite a nice Mormon temple, LDS temple. That's 300 feet high. Now the Indianapolis, Missouri state capitol is also 300 feet deep. So we have a double reference to 30 or 300 there, so it'll work either way. But what we have is, with so many of these things, there's multiple levels, and they just repeat throughout structures. So, for instance, the Louisiana Capitol building, so many others are just keeps going on and on. But we have 30 feet on the north and 48 feet on the southern side. 30 to 48 creates a 5-to-8 ratio, which brings us back to the golden number and the Fibonacci numbers, which will lead us to, again, these recurring themes. The recent series on New York, the recent series on Winnipeg, the ones I've done in regards to Sydney and across Australia, we have the same thing just repeating over and over again. Again, as I've said, in the infinite sea of numbers, this would not happen. This is architecture. This is architecture. It's design. It's built into it. So the Great Pyramid itself will bring us to these proportions from the Fibonacci's 89/55. That's the proportion of the Great Pyramid, which will then give us this 0.272727, which is the ratio of size of the Earth and the Moon. 30 feet in the ancient scale is 27.2727 on the Mohenjo-Daro scale. So the Harappan, the Indus Valley foot, going back 5,000 years, but on the Doric scale it's 2.2727. Again, just to shift a decimal point, it just keeps happening over and over again. And these are the so even the proportions. Here we see, for instance, idealized proportions of the Great Pyramid, and so that the circle and the square. So if you just twist it up, what we get is this very important in regards to the mysteries of geometry, and that these will connect to so many other points. Just in ones that I've already done in detail in regards to, for instance, the road width and footpath, or sidewalk dimensions, in which. So we begin with a street plan and we put buildings on top, and these system begins from the street plan. It's not just one building dropped on top. It goes back to the inception of the city and the concepts that go behind it. But of course, just as an illustration, that the Great Pyramid, amongst many other things, for instance, the proportions of the size of the Earth is built into the pyramid's proportions. It's in regards to its weights and measures, but of course we also have the dimensions of the Earth and the Moon in relation to size. Now, this same geometric proportions will also explain so many other things regarding Sun, Earth, Moon as well, and because I've repeated that in previous episodes, I'll update the graphics, but yeah, it's there, it's measurable, it's just not taught in school for some reasons, because they would prefer us to have this long string of decimal points that no one can memorize, and that's a whole other subject. But anyway, on the northern, or technically more like the northeastern side of the Missouri State Capitol, the columns are 30 feet high. Now, for instance, the Vesica, but even 90, or the number 9. Almost all of these numbers are built on the number 9, and by that I mean 9 times 3 is 27, 2 plus 7 is 9, 9 times 4 is 36, 3 plus 6 is 9. These are one of the really beautiful proportions about the number 9, and why it's so why it's so important, so much a recurring theme. Now, 12, you might think, well, that doesn't relate to 9. Well, that sort of does, because if you multiply it by 3, we get 36. So it is on this nice scale. Without going into all the basically recreational number theory, Hashad numbers, all these types of things, bring it in. But 12, 12 ages in the procession, 12 months on the calendar, 12 this, 12 that. But also, as what I've been trying to point out is that these things are based especially on New Jerusalem, or the holy city. And what are they trying to create? They're trying to create a holy city, like a divine proportion. Like, how do we mirror as above, so below? Well, by repeating the dimensions in the Ark of Utnapishtim or the New Jerusalem. But so, for instance, those columns are 30 feet, which is 360 inches, dimensions of the moon, Mayan calendar, 360-degree compass. You break down minutes and hours into seconds on both the clock and the compass. You come there. In geometry, so for instance, any four-sided, like a square with 360 degrees, while a circle is also defined by 360 degrees. Stock standard is the vesica. We have the sharp angle of the pentagon, golden number, platonic solids. Beautiful number in arithmetic, again, because 36 is 6 squared. 6 is such a beautiful, perfect, the most perfect of the perfect numbers in that way. And countless other little points that are, out of, basically these numbers, built around this, the harmonic scale, especially those around 9, are just loaded with stuff, but they'll also connect over now. 480 grains in a troy ounce. When you see the gold and silver price quoted, that's the ounce they're talking about, not the other ounce that you might know of. And the 48 days for Buddha under the Bodhi tree. Even again, how the troy ounce converts to metric, just beautiful. Again, the New Jerusalem and the Preserver of Life, or the Ark of Utnapishtim from the Epic of Gilgamesh. So the New Jerusalem, 12,000 furlongs base, 120 cubits for the Ark of Utnapishtim, and this will come up over and over. 1,080 grains. That's those columns. Well, 108 times the diameter of a sun is a distance to the Earth. 108 times the diameter of a moon is the distance from moon to the Earth. 108,000 kilometers, the maximum orbital speed of the Earth around the Sun. 108,000 kilometers, the polar diameter of Saturn, or Kronos, or Father Time. 1 hour of travel for the Earth is 1 hour is the diameter of Saturn. 1,080 times the diameter of a Sun, distance from Sun to Saturn. Just recurring. Now, in earlier I mentioned the square, so 360 degrees on the inside. On the outside, the defining angle will always be 1,080 grains, 108 degrees in the pentagram and in the pentagon. Across 3 dimensions, pentagram and pentagon being a perfect description of the golden ratio, so 108 degrees will define that as well. A yard is 108 barley corn. You'll see it in measures of liquid, measures in solids. Not only the so-called allegedly modern imperial, but going back to ancient times, but even modern scales, screen resolution, radios, etc., built around these numbers, hidden in plain sight. And of course, it's a constant across Eastern traditions. Now, going back before, for instance, in China, before Buddhism come to the fore, it's important in the Hindu faith, and of course, it's one of those most important numbers in Buddhism. For instance, Buddha had 108 symbols on each of his foot. Now, these were all based on, okay, I've mislabeled that. This is the south portico, the southern side. But earlier we saw the southern side 30 feet. Now we see the northern side at 48 feet. Also mentioned how that's connected to the Parthenon, Doric, Ionic and Corinthian, but for instance 48 feet is 1728 grains. The sun and the moon, 12 cubed, New Jerusalem, and of course the Ark of Utnapishtim, and the yugas, so cycles of time, in especially in Hindu faith. Now, even in just in maths in general, and so many other points, 1728 again is just one of these numbers that hit the sweet spot. It's not just about ancient mythology; it's about measurable test. Like you understood these numbers had an importance, and that's why it's connected to the more, let's say, mystical aspects. Again, will be a conversion point for the sun, but Mayan calendar, once more, screen resolution, modern screen resolution, also 24 squared, 192 palm. Again, you see these Pythagorean or scientific tuning reappearing. Just a reminder, I've got it labelled as north side. It's actually this would be the southern side. And 1440 hands. Well, sun, the moon, 1440 minutes per day, ancient weights and measures, modern screen resolution, geometry, 2D geometry, 3D geometry, especially the octahedron and how that angle, if you add all the angles up of the 5 platonic solids, you'll get to the octahedron times 10. The nonagon, but of course the vesica as always, hexagon. And 144, well, it's a Fibonacci number. It's the 12th Fibonacci number, and 144 is 12 squared. 1728 is 12 cubed. 144 is 12 squared. But also 3, 4, 5, so 3 to the first, etc. But then 1440, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's just lovely, beautiful. And again, of course, the New Jerusalem and the Ark of Utnapishtim, but also in, for instance, the Bible especially, like there are 12 tribes of 12,000, so 144,000. Still even hear that, but yes, so it's not just across multiple sets of measures in New Jerusalem and other places as well. Now, 1440, so the Mayan calendar, the Baktun, but also the Satya Yuga, which is 1728,000. But all of the yugas are broken up into divisions. So we have an entry, the middle, and the exit point, 144. Again, Rosicrucians, in Rosicrucian music, 144 octaves, 144 elements. Now, we earlier mentioned 48 brought that up earlier in regards to the 30-foot columns, but just as an example to bring it back, because they'll reinforce each other so often. Now, above that we'd have 32 cubits. Now, 32 over 33, Portolan mapping, masonry across churches. I'll have that 32 points, like the window, the stained glass window circles will be 32 points around a 33rd central core. And again, earlier I mentioned how 48 feet is a sweet spot, beautiful place as a conversion between the allegedly modern foot, Doric and Ionic. 1620 connections to again, sun, earth and moon will be over now. 720, well, the diameter of the moon, 720 league. 1 league is 3 miles, but we also get that in the Ionic and the long foot scale, and same with the sun as a conversion, but also 72 years per degree of precession. And the precessional cycle, whether in which constellation the spring equinox will rise, this is one of those joining points. Now, as with 108 or 144, the number 72 is one of these of the rich numbers. This is like the billionaire, superstar, rock star, one of those really important ones, because astronomy, geometry, weights and measures, and again, older, ancient systems, through to 720p screen resolution, which you might be watching this video on. Even how the 72F converts to 2953. Well, that's if you're into the synodic month, for instance. This is again, just all these things were, you could get any one of the videos I made and mash them all together. and that's all I can be, because each video is basically a repeat of the previous one, but that's the point, that these things are repeated over and over consistently through not just, they're not like off-the-shelf standard building materials that leads themselves to these important public buildings designed unique in that way, and again that they've been consistently and every single time the proportions of the building, for instance, the 300 by 200 in the square diameter, so we get a 3/2, or the Hermetic constant, or 540. That's the defining. That's any 5-sided polygon. You add the 5 angles together, you get 540. An octagon, 135 degrees in a perfect octagon, and they'll add to 1080. We mentioned 108 in previous points, and also of course Doric rods, 272727. Touched on that earlier, but just as another example, again I talked about, but the dimensions of the Great Pyramid and the Fibonacci numbers, the Earth and the Moon. All this geometry is loaded with information, and it just keeps coming back. Now, we can also convert. 48 is a sweet spot, so 48 feet is 45 Doric feet, is 50 Ionic feet. Now, in the future, I'm going to have to, I want to go through, because there's more to it than this. I'm just using the what we call now the standard divisions, and they still apply, but strictly speaking, there's some other stuff in regards to this, because the way that feet would be broken down into dactyls and these other subdivisions, again, just I'll add a whole new layers to this system. So I'm just keeping this again relatively simple. But Doric 60 span, Ionic 600 inches. Will 60 minutes per hour, 60 seconds per minute. That's going to happen on the compass once more, the size of the Earth, 6 being a perfect number across multiple dimensions, infinite dimensions. Also in the vesica now, it's 180 Doric palm is 1800 Ionic grains, and we have the Earth. We also have the vesica once more, and I should update this one, because again, this is not all in regards to this. No, it's like just keeps going. It's loaded and loaded with more info. But so those scales are all basically, they are on the Pythagorean scale. In the most simplest form, it's basically 9 and 27. So 9 times 2 is 18, times 2 is 36, etc., etc. 27 times 2 is 108, times 2 is 216. But there is another scale which isn't talked about so much. And so, for instance, anyway, the height of the wing. So on the side of a building, it's 88 feet. Well, for some reason, they chose to make 88 constellations the official number. 88 keys on a piano board, on a piano, and also Mercury, or Hermes, the planet itself. Essentially, 1 year is 88 days. 87.97, I think, is the official number, but still close enough, because of if you were to use that number, you'd be pretty much spot on. But anyway, without going into all the elliptical orbits and averages versus Wikipedia first page searches and absolutism in regards to that, that converts 88 feet converts to 264 hands, 264 on the leagues, 1 league being a mile. Ionic rods and long cubits. We have, again, harmonic, multiple sets of measures on the Earth, but also the canonical cubit, 1.728 feet. 1728, we saw that number earlier. That will bring us to the Sun, but also, again, a recurring theme in say, for instance, I mentioned the long scale. Well, 1056 inches will it makes that exactly 1000 long inches, because there are 1.056 feet per long foot or Persian foot. Now, the long foot could extend as far back as the earliest stages of Stonehenge, 3000 BC. Now, that of course has been sort of reverse engineered, but we do know that the Persian foot was essentially, well, what was this scale again within, we're talking a fraction of a mil in regards to there, but the maximum visible base of the pyramid, 1056 Jewish cubits, and the maximal visible base of New Jerusalem on 1056 cubits, I think it was, anyway, and a bunch of zeros on the end. But that also on the Doric and Ionic scale converts to 33, so 330 Doric palm, 3,300 Ionic grains, and we come back to the relatively modern Masonic tracing board, and again earlier mentioned the Salamis stone and this. Now Doric or Dorian or Ionic and Ionian are also scales, musical modes as well, and as Space Creator pointed out, that the actual conversion points for the measures are actually conversion points for the music too. But in regards to 33, earlier I mentioned that there is the Scottish Rite Cathedral in Joplin, Missouri, 33, and the Scottish Rite being very important, and that again this system connects at this particular number. Now, for instance, the Indianapolis Scottish Rite Cathedral, 330 feet long. The Tyler's Room is 33 feet wide. The columns on the House of a Temple in Washington, 33 columns times 33 feet high each one. There's no doubt it is what it is, and that they keep repeating. But on the Doric scale, that also will convert to 1,320. Again, no surprises, because this is one of those lovely points as well. So again, back to the nonagon. You might remember the importance of fish symbolism throughout this whole field, and 13,200 fish per last. That was a way of older weights and measures. They all incorporate knowledge. And on the long scale or long yard, so 1.056 hour yards is the long yard. But also, again, this will convert to 1,200 Royal Babylonian grains, and I've gone through again the references to 12, but once more to bring us to New Jerusalem and the Ark of Utnapishtim, 12 months per year, 12 constellations in the zodiac, or 12 ages in procession, as ever you want to look at it. Now, 12 apostles, 12 disciples, 12 people in a jury, 12 people on the board being a standard, the concept of 12 witnesses. This number is really important, like a dozen. Why did we choose that? Well, for one thing, you can divide it into thirds and quarters, but seems to be more than that's like built into the heavens, so to speak. For instance, full moons, 12.369 per year. So that's pretty much it. There are more than a few other details worth pursuing if you're interested, of course. If you follow this pathway, I highly recommend anything and everything by Scott Onstott or Randall Carlson especially. And you follow through the links from those gentlemen, and you'll find again so many other very interesting researches, theories, very important data in regards to this. Now I like to follow it through the numbers and the weights and measures, because of you can there's meat on the bone there, but I know that other people follow it in other paths, and again it's multiple levels. There's so much more to it, and but at the core is this concept of harmony or unity. So at a unity point where these supposedly separate, unconnected measure systems all come together at very beautiful points, which will also harmonize with the concepts of the Temple of Man, otherwise New Jerusalem, or the Ark of Utnapishtim. You'll find it in temples all across the world, how symbolic references to important religious traditions and mythologies, but especially through the Quadrivium, arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy, that these points will again harmonize not just the mythology and the symbols, but also the varying, again, allegedly separated systems of weights and measures. And sun, earth and moon, as above, so below. The Hermetic principle, Mercury or Hermes or Thoth, as in the Egyptian tradition, the god of weights and measures, the god of commerce, the god for travelers, and many other points. But anyway, that's Missouri, state capital there. Hope you enjoyed and have a good one.